In the early morning hours of April 18th, 2016, a church in Midlothian, Texas sat empty. No congregation, no choir, no sound except the low mechanical hum of a building waiting to be used. Inside that church, someone was already walking the halls. Not running, not hiding, walking. And less than an hour later, a woman named Missy Bevers would be dead. This is where the Missy Bevers case begins, not with the crime itself, but with what happened before it. This is the Midnight Mystery Archive, and this is part 1 of the Missy Bevers case. Before we talk about the figure and tactical gear, before we talk about surveillance angles and timelines, we have to do something that's easy to forget in cases like this. We need to start with Missy. Because if we don't, the case collapses into an image, a grainy video of someone walking down a hallway. And the truth is, Missy Bevers wasn't a headline. She wasn't just a case. She was a person with a schedule, a routine, a family, and a community that still hasn't gotten an answer. Police and local reporting consistently describe Missy as a 45-year-old fitness instructor, a Camp Gladiator coach, killed at Creekside Church of Christ in Midlothian while preparing for an early morning class. That quote-unquote preparing for class detail matters more than it seems. It tells us the setting wasn't random. The timing wasn't random. And if the person inside the church was there with intent, then Missy's routine becomes part of the crime. So today in part 1, we're going to build the foundation the right way. Who Missy was in this context, how the morning was supposed to go, and why routine is often the hinge that separates coincidence from planning. The internet version of Missy Bevers is a thumbnail. A smiling picture next to the words Unsolved. But the real Missy Bevers, based on how people close to her describe her in later coverage, was someone who worked hard, showed up early, and built relationships through consistency. A 2025 CBS Texas piece, looking back nearly 10 years later, quotes a friend describing Missy as humble and dedicated to helping people with fitness and healthy habits. Someone she saw regularly, week after week, for an entire year. That doesn't solve a case, but it anchors a truth that matters. Missy was someone who ran on reliability, and reliability creates patterns. Patterns create predictability, and predictability can be exploited. If you've ever been part of a workout group that meets at 5 a.m., you know the rules without anyone saying them out loud. People are half awake. They drive the same roads. They park in the same places. They arrive in clusters. And the instructor usually gets there early to set up. In Missy's case, that 5 a.m. class start time is repeatedly referenced in coverage of the morning's events. Her students arriving for class and then discovering something was wrong. And that tells us something important. If someone wanted a window of time where a building would be empty, but about to become occupied, this kind of class schedule offers exactly that. It creates a narrow corridor. Too early, and no one is there. Too late, and the class is arriving. So if you're trying to understand intent, you don't start with the costume. You start with the clock. Here is what the morning was supposed to look like. Missy arrives early. She sets up for class. People start showing up. They work out. They go to work. Normal. Instead, that routine fractures hard around a timeline that police and local reporting have laid out with unusually specific timestamps. Fox 4 published an updated April 18th timeline that includes these key points. 3:50 a.m., the suspect first appears on surveillance inside the church. 4:16 a.m., Missy's pickup is seen driving into the church parking lot. 4:20 a.m., Missy is seen on video walking into the building. 4:35 a.m., a participant arrives for the fitness class. 5 a.m., 2 911 calls are received. 5:01 a.m., fire department dispatched. 5:03 a.m., initial patrol officers dispatched. 5:07 a.m., fire department arrives. 5:10 a.m., officers arrive. I want to sit with that for just a second, because these times don't just tell us what happened. They tell us what could have happened and what couldn't have happened. The reason this case is still so gripping is that we have something rare. We have the before, not a full picture, not the crime itself, but the minutes leading into it. The suspect appears on camera at 3:50 a.m., a full half hour before Missy's truck arrives in the parking lot at 4:16 a.m. That gap is everything, because a person inside the building at 3:50 a.m. is not reacting to Missy arriving. They're operating on their own timeline, and that creates the first big question of the series. Were they there for Missy specifically, or were they there for whoever might show up next? We're going to be careful with this. We're not going to force an answer, but we can outline what the timeline implies. If someone is inside the church at 3:50 a.m., they likely had time, privacy, and freedom of movement. And if Missy arrives at 4:16 and enters at 4:20, then her arrival doesn't start the story. It interrupts it. There's a reason 4:16 a.m. hits listeners in the gut. It's not just the timestamp. It's the moment Missy's ordinary routine intersects with someone else's plan. Fox 4's timeline specifies that Missy's pickup appears on video, entering the parking lot at 4:16 a.m., and that she is seen walking into the building at 4:20 a.m. 4 minutes. Think about that. 4 minutes from wheels in to walking inside. That's the small ritual of arriving somewhere early. Park, grab your things, walk in, flip lights, start setting up. And what makes this so haunting is what a friend says in the CBS Texas retrospective. She describes Missy not being aware someone was already inside, and that within minutes of encountering them, she's killed. Now, we need to be precise. That quote is a friend's recollection and interpretation, not an official police statement about exact movements. But it does align with the timeline's brutal implication. Missy arrives, Missy enters, and before the class can even begin to assemble, something catastrophic happens. This stage, we can say a few things with confidence, grounded in published reporting and police-released timeline points. Missy was killed at Creekside Church of Christ while preparing for an early morning fitness class. Surveillance shows a suspect inside the church before she arrives, first appearing around 3:50 a.m. Missy's vehicle arrives around 4:16 a.m., and she is seen entering around 4:20 a.m. A class participant arrives at 4:35, and 911 calls are made at 5 a.m. What we cannot responsibly do yet is claim publicly confirmed details about exactly where inside the building Missy encountered the suspect, what was said, if anything, what weapon was used beyond the limited early reporting references that vary by outlet, and the precise sequence of the assault. There's a reason those details are often limited in public messaging, protecting investigative integrity and evidence. So the approach here, our approach, has to be disciplined. We build from what's real, what's timed, and what's documented. And we don't fill gaps with certainty. If someone shows up inside the church before Missy arrives, we have two broad possibilities. Possibility A, Missy is the target, meaning the suspect knows her schedule, knows she will enter, and is inside waiting. Possibility B, the church is the target, and Missy is the first to arrive, meaning the suspect is there for some other reason, whether it's staging, burglary, vandalism, or something else, and Missy's arrival triggers violence. Here's what makes this hard. Robbery doesn't fit cleanly in early reporting because the behavior in the footage, the breaking glass, wandering, doesn't read like a quick in and out theft. Personal targeting doesn't fit cleanly either, unless the person had enough knowledge to align with Missy's early schedule. And the truth is, at this point in the series, we don't get to pick which is more satisfying. We only get to ask which is more consistent with what we can support. So we keep both on the table without committing. Here's something the timeline reveals that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. If Missy enters at 4:20 and a participant arrives at 4:35, that means a student is within 15 minutes of walking into the orbit of a homicide scene, maybe closer than they will ever know. That matters for two reasons. One, it narrows the window for the crime. Two, it means the morning is not as isolated as it feels. Even if no one sees the suspect directly, there are vehicles on roads, residents waking up, early workers, possibly other cameras in the area. This is why routine is so important. It doesn't just create predictability for an offender. It creates predictability for witness opportunities, which leads into something else we'll build later. Why law enforcement often focuses on vehicles, movements, and micro timelines in cases like this. Before we go any further into theories, suspects, or motive, we need to do something most coverage of this case skips entirely. We need to familiarize ourselves with the building. Because crimes don't happen in abstractions. They happen in rooms, hallways, doorways, and blind spots. And in the Missy Bevers case, the physical environment doesn't just matter. It shapes nearly every unanswered question. Everything from timing to movement to what the surveillance cameras captured and didn't capture is dictated by the church itself. So let's slow down and situate ourselves inside Creekside Church of Christ as it existed in April of 2016. A church is not a bar. It's not a convenience store. It's not a residence. It's a hybrid space, open by design, but not continuously occupied. According to reporting from WFAA and CBS News, Creekside Church of Christ had multiple exterior entrances, long interior hallways, classrooms branching off main corridors, and a central worship area. This matters because buildings like this create zones of isolation. At 4 a.m., those zones are silent. And silence does something important. It amplifies movement. Every footstep echoes. Every door sounds louder than expected. Every broken pane is not masked by ambient noise. Which means if someone is inside the building at that hour, they're either unconcerned with noise or confident no one else is there yet. That's our first environmental clue. One of the most persistent misunderstandings in this case is the assumption that the disguise is the mystery, and it isn't. The real mystery begins earlier. How did this person get inside the church before Missy arrived? Police have consistently stated that there was no obvious forced entry at the exterior doors, based on early reporting and press briefings covered by WFAA. That immediately narrows possibilities. If there's no forced entry, then entry likely came through an unlocked door, a door opened by someone with access, or a door that could be manipulated without visible damage. Churches often leave certain doors unlocked overnight, not out of negligence, but out of tradition and accessibility. But here's where we need to be careful. Police have never publicly confirmed which door was used, and that silence is important. It suggests either the information is sensitive to the investigation or multiple access points are possible. Either way, the lack of a clear forced entry narrative removes one of the simplest explanations early on. Their surveillance footage is often described as creepy, unnerving, or chilling. Those descriptors are emotional, but they're not analytical. So let's analyze what the footage actually shows, according to police released clips and summaries referenced by Dateline NBC and 48 Hours. The person inside the church moves without urgency, opens doors calmly, walks hallways confidently, does not appear to be lost, and does not rush from room to room. This suggests orientation. Not necessarily familiarity, but comfort. And there's a difference. Someone can be unfamiliar with a building and still be comfortable inside it if they believe they have time and privacy. And time is exactly what the timeline tells us they had. From approximately 3:50 a.m. until 4:16 a.m., the person is inside the building without Missy present. That's more than 25 minutes. That is not a panicked window. That is a working window. One of the most debated moments in the footage is the suspect breaking glass inside the building. At first glance, this confuses people. Why break glass if you're trying not to be noticed? But that question assumes the suspect is worried about being heard. At 4 a.m. in an empty church with no one expected for another 15 or 20 minutes, breaking interior glass is not necessarily reckless. What matters is which glass was broken, where it was located, and whether it provided access or simply destructive. Police have not publicly clarified exactly why the glass was broken or what it accomplished functionally. And that omission matters, because glass breaking can mean forced access to an interior room, staging, vandalism, or an attempt to create the appearance of a burglary. But it does not automatically mean panic or improvisation, especially when it's followed by calm movement rather than flight. Another trap in this case is over-reliance on what the cameras show. Security cameras do not record reality. They record angles. Church security systems are often installed for deterrence and general monitoring, not forensic reconstructions. That means there's limited frame rates, ceiling-mounted perspectives, blind spots in corners and intersections. According to law enforcement statements referenced in national coverage, not every area of the church was covered by cameras, and that's critical. Because when viewers say, "Why didn't we see X?" the answer may simply be, the camera couldn't see it. This means the encounter with Missy is not on video, portions of the suspect's movements are not recorded, and gaps exist that cannot be filled visually. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. The most important moments in this case happened off camera. Another detail often overlooked is lighting. Interior lighting in churches overnight is typically minimal, maybe emergency lights, hallway illumination, selective fixtures. Low light changes perception. It distorts depth, exaggerates silhouettes, hides facial features, and makes clothing appear bulkier. This matters for later debates about the suspect's size, build, and gait. Because what looks like body type on grainy, low-light footage is often shadow behavior, not anatomy. Law enforcement has repeatedly cautioned against drawing firm conclusions about the suspect's gender or physical characteristics from the footage alone, a warning echoed in Dateline NBC interviews. Let's revisit something quietly important. Missy's truck appears at 4:16 a.m. She enters at 4:20 a.m. Between those times, she is moving through exterior space into interior space. Where is the suspect at that moment? We don't know. And that uncertainty exists because not all areas are on camera, not all angles overlap, and movement between zones can happen invisibly. This creates a scenario where Missy and the suspect could have crossed paths without being recorded, or the suspect could have heard her arrival before seeing her, or the suspect could have positioned themselves intentionally. Architecture creates opportunity, and opportunity doesn't require chaos, only timing. One question that comes up often is why no alarm was triggered. Church alarm systems vary widely. Some arm only exterior doors. Some require manual activation. Some are disabled during certain hours. Police have not publicly detailed the alarm configuration of Creekside Church, which means we cannot assume that an alarm should have gone off or that its absence indicates inside access. But the lack of a publicly acknowledged alarm activation reinforces a key point. Nothing about this scene forced immediate response. Whatever happened unfolded in a window where the building was expected to be empty, noise did not bring help, and time existed without interruption. Now this is subtle, but it's important. In many violent crimes, the environment tells a story of urgency. Overturned furniture, frantic movement, chaotic paths. But in this case, based on what police have released and described, there's no public indication of widespread disorder throughout the building. The suspect's movements on camera is measured. The timeline is controlled. The encounter happens within a narrow window. This doesn't mean the crime wasn't violent. It means the lead-up wasn't frantic. And that distinction matters when we eventually talk about intent. A thing to keep in mind is this was not random chaos, but it does not answer the central question. The architecture, access, and camera coverage can support two competing interpretations. Someone waiting for Missy, someone already inside when Missy arrived. And at this point, both remain possible, which is why the next step isn't speculation, it's precision. Because to understand whether Missy was targeted or encountered, we have to go deeper into the minute-by-minute timeline, not just the building. And that's what we're going to do next. The official public timeline begins at 3:50 a.m. because that is the first moment a person appears on surveillance video inside the church. But it's important to acknowledge something quietly but honestly. The story does not start at 3:50. It starts earlier. We just don't get to see that part. For someone to appear on camera at 3:50 a.m., several things must have already happened. They arrived at the property, they accessed the building, and they moved into a camera-covered area. How long that took is unknown. It could have been minutes, it could have been longer. And that matters because it means the suspect's presence inside the church is not spontaneous at 3:50. It is a result of actions taken before the camera ever sees them. At approximately 3:50 a.m., surveillance footage captures a person inside Creekside Church of Christ, and it is not Missy Bevers. Police have been explicit on this point from the earliest briefings. The person is dressed in what appears to be police-style tactical gear, a helmet, vest, boots, and their face is completely obscured. What's important here is not just who the person is, It's how they move. They are not running. They are not crouching. They are not darting between spaces. They walk. That choice, walking, tells us something important about perceived risk. People who believe they might be interrupted tend to move quickly. People who believe they have time don't. For roughly the next 10 to 15 minutes, the person moves through the interior of the building. Doors are opened, hallways are walked, at least one pane of interior glass is broken. And yet there is no visible urgency. This is where many people begin to misunderstand the case. They assume if someone is committing a crime, they would hurry. But that assumption only holds if the person believes someone else might arrive, an alarm might trigger, or time is limited. At this point in the timeline, none of those pressures appear to exist. And that suggests either confidence, planning, or both. As the footage continues, something subtle but important happens. The person's movement appears to slow. At times, they seem to pause. This has led to speculation that the suspect was waiting. We need to be careful with that word. Waiting implies intent. What we can say responsibly is this: the person is not behaving as though they are trying to leave quickly. And that observation, combined with the known schedule of Missy's class, creates an unavoidable question. Were they inside the building because they knew someone would arrive soon? At this stage, the timeline alone does not answer that, but it certainly raises the question. At approximately 4:16 a.m., as we've already discussed, Missy Bevers' pickup truck is captured entering the church parking lot. This timestamp comes from an external surveillance footage and has been cited consistently in local reporting and police timelines. This moment is one of the most emotionally difficult in the case, not because anything violent happens on camera, but because it represents the last ordinary action of Missy. She arrives expecting a normal morning. She does not know that someone is already inside, that the building is no longer empty, and her routine has been interrupted. And the timeline gives us no indication that she hesitates. There is roughly a 4-minute gap between Missy's vehicle entering the parking lot and her being seen on interior video walking into the church. 4 minutes is not long, but it's long enough to gather belongings, lock a vehicle, walk to an entrance, unlock or open a door. It is also long enough for someone inside the building to hear a vehicle, see headlights, or sense that the building is no longer empty. What we do not know is whether the suspect noticed her arrival, whether Missy noticed anything unusual, and whether the two were aware of each other before entering the same interior space. The timeline doesn't answer that, and police have never publicly filled in that gap. At approximately 4:20 a.m., Missy Bevers is seen on interior surveillance footage walking into the church. This is the last publicly released video of her alive. From here on, the case moves off camera, and that is one of the hardest truths for listeners to accept. Because everything people most want to know, the encounter, the confrontation, the moment violence begins, happens outside the public record and outside of the eyes of cameras. Police have never released an exact timestamp for when Missy was attacked. What we know is constrained by what happens after. There is no recorded alarm. There is no immediate 911 call. There is no interruption. That tells us the encounter occurs in a window where no one else is inside the building, no one intervenes, and the violence ends before anyone arrives. The lack of a precise time here is not negligence, it's just reality. Because once events move into blind spots, whether architectural or investigative, time becomes inferred, not recorded. At approximately 4:35 a.m., the first participant arrives for the fitness class. This timestamp is one of the most chilling in the entire case, because it tells us how close help was without knowing it. This person does not immediately discover the crime. That suggests one of several possibilities. Missy is not immediately visible, the location of the attack is out of sight, or the student does not yet realize what has happened. What matters here is not speculation. What matters is proximity. The crime has already occurred, or is ending, within 15 minutes of another person arriving. That is an extremely narrow window. Between 4:35 a.m. and 5 a.m., something changes. Participants arrive. They expect class. Something feels wrong. Details here are intentionally vague in public reporting, and that's appropriate. Different outlets describe concern, confusion, and a reported inability to locate Missy. What we do know is that by 5 a.m., the situation has escalated enough for emergency calls to be made. At 5 a.m., 2 911 calls are received. This is the first moment the outside world is alerted that something is wrong. And notice what that means. From 4:20 a.m., when Missy enters the building, to 5 a.m., when 911 is called, there is a 40-minute span in which the crime occurs, the suspect leaves, and the building transitions from isolated to occupied. That span becomes one of the most critical investigative windows in the case. At 5:01 a.m., the fire department is dispatched. At 5:03, police officers are dispatched. By 5:07 a.m., fire personnel arrive, and at 5:10, officers arrive on the scene. These are fast response times, which tells us something important. The delay in this case is not about emergency services. The delay exists before they're called. At this point, we can responsibly say several things about the timeline without interpretation. The suspect is inside the church before Missy arrives. Missy arrives believing the building is empty. The encounter and murder occur within a narrow window before others arrive. The suspect leaves without being seen or identified. But the timeline also rules things out. It makes it very difficult to argue a spontaneous confrontation after Missy arrived, a crime triggered by surprise, or a prolonged struggle extending into class arrival. The timeline suggests compression, not chaos. If you strip away everything else, the gear, the video, the speculation, the timeline leaves us with one unavoidable truth. This was not a crime that unfolded slowly. It unfolded inside of a narrow corridor of time, and narrow corridors favor preparation, anticipation, and control. That doesn't tell us why, but it tells us how, and how is often the only honest starting point in an unsolved case. By the end of this part 1, we haven't answered the central question of the Missy Bevers case, and that's intentional. What we've done instead is something far more important for an investigation that remains unsolved. We've slowed the story down. We've placed Missy back into her own life, not just into the moment she was killed, but into the routine that shaped her mornings, her work, and that final day. We've walked the building, not as a symbol, but as a physical space with doors, hallways, blind spots, and time windows that matter. And we've let the timeline speak for itself. Because when you strip this case of speculation and internet certainty, what you're left with is something unsettlingly narrow. A short window of time, an empty building that wasn't supposed to be empty, and a person inside it before Missy ever arrived. That doesn't tell us why this happened, but it tells us how much intention was required for it to happen at all. And intention is where this case becomes difficult and where careless theories begin to fall apart. Next week in part 2, we'll move beyond the building and the clock. We'll examine how investigators began narrowing possibilities, how early assumptions were tested and sometimes discarded, and why identifying suspects in this case has proven so resistant to certainty. Because the Missy Bevers case isn't defined by a lack of information. It's defined by how carefully that information has to be handled. This has been the Midnight Mystery Archive and part 1 of the Missy Bevers case. Really quick, as a reminder, if you trust this podcast, if you've been around since the beginning, please do me a favor, go to Apple Podcasts and Spotify and leave me a review. It is so helpful in bringing new listeners to the podcast to join our group. In addition to that, MidnightMysteryArchive.com is live. You can stream episodes there. You can also submit a case. If you've got a case that you'd like me to cover on the podcast, send me the information. I'll look into it, and we'll see. Maybe it'll show up on the schedule for cases. In addition to that, the Midnight Mystery Archive Facebook group is live. Please go join. I post about the cases that we discuss here on the podcast, other true crime news, and start good conversations. I appreciate you listening. We'll see you on Monday for our part 1 mini episode of Missy Bevers, and then next Friday for part 2. Until next time.